All right. This time we're doing 25. Burundi, one of two small countries nestled between the Great Lakes of Africa. I always mix it up with Rwanda. Burundi is the southern one. Geography. Burundi sits northeast of Lake Tanganyika, part of the complex that is the East African Rift. The Ruzizi River flows south through the flat Imbo Valley, separated from the country's highlands by the high Congo-Nile Ridge, named for dividing the watersheds of each great river system. This is where the country's highest point, Mount Hea, lies, 8,806 feet, 2,684 meters. A plethora of waters flow through the highlands, cutting the plateau up into numerous hills and valleys. These highlands make much of Burundi temperate year-round, a nice 70-72 degrees, 21-22 Celsius. Lower elevations are tropical, but never very hot. Close to the equator, Burundi's dry season is a short June to August. The long wet season, however, isn't nearly as intense as equatorial places westward. Most of Burundi is covered in the montane forests of the Albertine Rift. The northeastern bit opens up into the Lake Victoria mosaic, while southeast it opens further into Miombo woodlands. Like much of East Africa, Burundi is home to a great array of plants and animals, but habitat loss and poaching threaten wild populations. Already, gorillas and elephants have been rendered locally extinct. Patwa. Burundi has been inhabited a long, long time, just like Tanzania. One thing I should have mentioned. Remember back in Cameroon, we talked about the chromosomal Adam? Well, Adam needs his Eve, and genetic studies have narrowed down her original home to somewhere between the Zambezi River and the Horn of Africa. It was she, our great times a few thousand grandmother, who passed down the DNA in her mitochondria, the mitochondrial Eve. Now, just like the Cameroon Adam, Tanzania Eve, Tanzan Eva, was not the Eve. She was not the first woman. She lived several 100,000 years ago, but probably neither in the same place nor time as Cameroon Adam. But Tanzania Eve's lineage is the only one of Homo sapiens to have survived to the present. Fast forward tens of thousands of years, and her descendants spread across the earth. But in Africa, they coalesced into our three stock races of Southern, Central, and East Africans. They mingled in different proportions along gradients. Here in Burundi, the pygmy ancestry appears to dominate. Makes sense in the forests. Later arrivals called these people Batwa, a term I've been using for the mixed pygmy Khoisan folk south of the jungle, but really just refers to wild folk who neither farmed nor raised animals for food. These Batwa of the Great Lakes are therefore related but distinct from those of the southern Congo and East Africa. Bantu. After millennia of hunting and gathering, the Batwa's world was flipped upside down when the dynamic Bantu people broke into East Africa. Exactly when is tricky to say. We'll say by the first century, but it was certainly a process that took centuries to complete. By the end, however, the Batwa were pushed into the mountains, left to scratch a living procuring pelts and other wild goods for trade with the Bantu in exchange for foodstuffs and tools. Intermarriage, consensual or not, also took place. The Bantu of Burundi comprise part of the northern Lacustrian Bantu, inhabiting the arc between the northern Great Lakes. Despite the name, the northern Lacustrian Bantu and southern Lacustrian Bantu are not closely related. In the highlands between Lakes Victoria and Kivu, the western branch of our Lacustrian friends becomes distinct as the first millennium wears on. By its end, they cleave again along Kivu and the Ruzizi River, west the forest Kivu, east the highland Kivu. Kingdom of Burundi. If you're a long-time viewer, you'll know by this point in time the growth of populations and trade routes stimulate development in many societies in East Africa. We're talking Zimbabwe, Marawi, the Swahili, and Gitara north, whom we haven't spent much time on. The lands around the Great Lakes are well-watered and very fertile. Population growth begat powerful chieftains, and powerful chieftains begat kings. Organized kingdoms made trade easier to facilitate and protect, and trade gave kingdoms wealth to enforce their power. Which came first? It's a chicken and egg kind of thing. From what I've read, it seems in the Great Lakes they traded a number of things with the Swahili coast. Yes, including slaves, but ivory was the big moneymaker. We'll talk more about Kitara when it's Uganda's turn, but having a large and powerful empire on your doorstep can make you a little nervous, and the Highland Kivu organized themselves to avoid being the smaller fish. In this third model for state development, decentralized societies accrete to respond to threats on their borders. There must have been dozens of small petty kingdoms in the wake of Katara's rise, but information is hard to find about them. The main ones are Karagwe, which was a Rutara kingdom, not Kivu, and Rwanda, which is. Both of these were founded sometime towards the end of the Middle Ages, we'll say 1450. Sometime later, 1550, the trend spreads further south, Gisaka north of the Nyabarongo River, and Bugesera north of the Ruvubu River. According to tradition, only in 1680 were the southern highlanders united into a kingdom of Burundi, centered at Gitega under Mwami, or King, Intari I. The remaining Kivu left out become the Ha people. The name Burundi is hard to pin down, but seems to basically mean land of the Rundi people. What Rundi means, according to the Kurundi online dictionary, is something like other one, in reference to Rwanda being the first. That's the best I got. Either way, these four Highland Kivu kingdoms share a few similarities. In addition to speaking dialects of a single language, they also came to be divided into three groups: the Batwa, the Hutu, and the Tutsi. Now, the Hutu seem to have been the original Bantu farmers, but the Tutsi are a different puzzle. So this whole Hutu-Tutsi deal is a big can of worms that I'll have to fully open in Rwanda, but the stories suggest the Tutsi wandered into the region and found the Hutu already there. Where the Tutsi came from originally is a good question. Limited genetic evidence leans towards either Kushites from the Horn of Africa or Nilotes from Sudan. In contrast to the agricultural Hutu, the Tutsi raised herds of cattle. The question of the Tutsi's origin is complicated by centuries of intermarriage with the Hutu. But the Tutsi became a ruling elite over the Hutu in these kingdoms. Burundi, however, seems to have been an exception. The noble elite of the kingdom were termed Ganwa, who apparently considered themselves separate from both Hutu and Tutsi, despite later attempts to tie them to the latter. Between Burundi and Bugesera, Bugesera was actually the more powerful for the longest time. The four fought intermittent wars with one another for centuries, stealing loot like cattle. Finally, Bugesera suffered a 1-2 punch from both Rwanda and Burundi around 1850. King Intari IV moved in and divided the territory with Rwanda. Sadly, after his death, Mwezi IV would have trouble managing against his brother's ambitions. The king, however, won a major victory against Zanzibari slavers, ensuring the Rundi people were safe from such threats. The king also did not trust European explorers now poking around the region, the famous ones too, but the king made sure their time in his kingdom was short, under pain of death. The Berlin Conference in 1885 and the Anglo-German Treaty of 1890 conferred to Germany the lands between the east coast and Lake Tanganyika, Burundi included. Initially, Mwezi paid little heed to this, but disturbances in the Congo allowed German forces to advance further inland, and they assured the king's power against his rivals. In 1896, Mwezi accepted German overlordship, and Burundi was formally annexed into German East Africa, though in practice the kingdom continued to rule its territory. For the time, the western sliver of Burundi was apportioned to the Congo Free State along a north-northeast line drawn back in 1885. By now, a 16-mile strip of that border had been leased to Britain for a railroad. Rwanda joined its neighbor in the German fold the next year. German protection permitted missionaries to begin spreading the Christian truth throughout the land, but a power struggle erupted from the Hutu. A rival King Kilima utilized the Hutus' discontent to establish his own power base, and massacres of Tutsis followed, not to be the last. Despite orders to the contrary from Governor von Goetzen, local German officials used this as an opportunity to undermine Mwezi's rule to make things more agreeable for them. By the time von Goetzen fired his representative, kicked out Kilima, and corralled the Rundi chiefs back under Mwezi, Burundi was left hurt and betrayed by her colonial protector. An outbreak of rinderpest against cattle didn't help matters either. 1910, 2 years after the Belgian annexation of the Congo, the borders were readjusted. Between Lakes Kivu and Tanganyika, the German-Belgian border ran along the length of the Ruzizi River. German rule didn't last, of course, with the outbreak of World War I. Colonial governors had initially wanted to avoid the conflict spilling into Africa, but before 1914's ends, operations in East Africa had begun. 1916, the Belgians invaded from the west, culminating in the capture of Tabora. and a great increase in bargaining power for the Belgians, who, it might be remarked, in Europe were almost entirely occupied by Germany. By war's end in 1918, Belgium occupied the northwest of East Africa, Britain most everything else. Rwanda Urundi. Britain almost certainly wanted all of German East Africa for their Cape to Cairo designs, but were compelled by the League of Nations to allow Belgium a small bit as spoils of war. The Treaty of Versailles granted to Belgium the districts of Rwanda and Burundi, from the Rwandan part of the border, along the Nyabarongo River, south along some lines and bridges to the Ruvubu River, more lines to the Moyowosi River a short ways, a third set of lines to the Lugusi River, down to where it merges into the Rampungwe River, and then up where it flows into the Malagarasi River, and finally going west from those headwaters to the shore of Lake Tanganyika. In this, the kingdoms of Rwanda and Burundi went to Belgium, officially in 1922, as a Class B mandate territory of Rwanda Urundi. Evidently, someone in the Belgian colonial office understood the B was a locative prefix you could do without. The Belgian government never wanted the Congo, and now it got another foreign possession to develop and defend. The capital was moved to Usumbura in the Imbo Valley, easier to get to from the Congo. King Mwambutsa IV continued as the young puppet ruler on behalf of the Belgians. To solidify their control, Belgium formalized the Hutu-Tutsi power structure. Before then, there were poor and wealthy examples of both, and it was difficult to tell them apart at a glance. The Belgians quantified cattle ownership as one of the qualifications to be Tutsi, and even added height and facial and head features to the list. This fit into the Hamitic hypothesis, which we'll talk more about in Rwanda, but suggested that the Tutsis were whiter and more European than their Hutu subjects, fitting into 20th century European racial attitudes. This had some terrible consequences, but besides this, the Belgians don't seem to have done much with Rwanda Urundi. They promised the League of Nations to invest in education, but they left that to missionaries, Catholic and Protestant, such that Christianity quickly spread throughout the country. The territory also furnished workers for mines in neighboring Congo. When the League of Nations was replaced with the United Nations in 1946, the old mandates were rebranded as trusts. Now the goal for all trusts was eventual independence. The rise of African nationalism, international pressure to decolonize, and Belgium's precarious post-war situation compelled them to withdraw from the Congo in 1960. If you remember, a civil war erupted soon afterwards. What's more, the Hutu had become increasingly frustrated with the power and influence of the Tutsi, and this led to the Rwandan Revolution and the overthrow of the king in 1961. In Urundi, Prince Louis Rwagasore managed to unite the ethnic groups of the kingdom in the Union for National Progress, UPRONA, Urundi for Urundians, in opposition to the pro-Belgian Christian Democratic Party, PDC. Urundi held an election in September of 1961. UPRONA won an overwhelming majority, only for a conspiracy of PDC leaders and Belgian officials to assassinate Prince Rwagasore 2 weeks later. The Belgians poisoned the well, so to speak, before renaming the territory Rwanda-Burundi and splitting off Burundi along the Ruhwa River, south just west of the Congo-Nile ridgecrest, thence east to the Kanyaru River, down to Lake Kyohoa, across to Lake Reru, and finally along the Nyabarongo River. This gave Burundi more or less the borders it had before colonization. Actual independence came July 1st, 1962. And Usumbura was also renamed Bujumbura. Neither upheaval in Congo and Rwanda nor being swallowed into Tanzania appealed to Burundi, and they went their own way. It's impossible to know what might have been if the prince survived, but the king originally tried to maintain a balance of Hutu and Tutsi in government. But the Rwandan Revolution led to the massacre of thousands of Tutsi, while hundreds of thousands fled, many to Burundi. The Tutsi of Burundi became worried such violence would spread, and one wayward Rwandan Tutsi refugee murdered the Prime Minister of Burundi, Pierre Ngendandumwe, a Hutu. The government became ever more anti-Hutu, not helped by a failed 1965 coup. A successful one in 1966 brought Prince Ntare to the throne, only to be in turn deposed months later by Prime Minister Michel Micombero. He declared the Republic of Burundi, Repubulika y'Uburundi, November 28, 1966. Republic of Burundi. President Mikombero felt the monarchy had been too lenient on Hutu subversives and established a military dictatorship. Fear of a Hutu uprising became a self-fulfilling prophecy when in 1972 bands of Hutu militias seized weapons and began killing Tutsi men, women, and children, around 1,000 people. So naturally, Mikombero's Tutsi regime responded with the Ikiza, 4 months of wanton slaughter claiming the lives of some 200 to 300,000 Hutus, with as many fleeing to Tanzania. And for good measure, they executed Prince Ntare V so the Hutus could not rally to their king. More sensible heads prevailed when Colonel Jean-Baptiste Bagaza couped Mikombero in 1976, attempting political and social reform and trying to ease the tensions between Tutsi and Hutu. But Bagaza angered the military and got himself overthrown by Pierre Buyoya in 1987, another military dictator. Ethnic tensions flared once again, and another 100,000 people died in the violence. Of course, by 1991, Buyoya was now advocating for democratic reform. 1993, Melchior Ndadaye was elected president, a Hutu. So naturally, a Tutsi extremist in the army assassinated him. This was the last straw, and the Hutu rose up across the country, murdering whatever Tutsis they could find. What's more, new President Cyprien Ntaryamira, another Hutu, and Rwandan President Juvenal Habyarimana, also Hutu, were killed when some unknown actor fired a missile at their plane in 1994. Regardless of who did it or why, this sparked civil war and genocide in Burundi, which, when combined with civil war and genocide in Rwanda, prompted Tanzania's Julius Nyerere, no longer president, to decry that the two small nations were nothing but trouble for Africa and that Tanzania should just annex them both and be done with it. It's hard to blame Mr. Nyerere, as Zaire's Mobutu admitted Hutu refugees, causing spillover that precipitated the First Congo War, his own downfall, and the Second Congo War, the deadliest conflict since World War II. The Burundian Civil War seesawed through the 90s as the death toll mounted up. Buyoya returned to power after a coup against President Ntibantunganya in 1996. Peace talks commenced finally in 2000, but it wasn't until 2003 that all major rebel groups agreed to ceasefire. A power sharing agreement was hashed out to maintain a Hutu-Tutsi balance in government. Domitien Ndayizeye kicked off the new Burundi. Meanwhile, the poor nation would have to recover from a decade of grueling, hateful violence, leaving some 300,000 dead and 500,000 displaced. 2005, the first truly free election was held, won handedly by Pierre Nkurunziza. He truly promoted ethnic unity in Burundi by instead dividing Tutsi, Hutu, and even Batwa into those part of the political class and those not. Political authoritarianism soon returned, and Nkurunziza clamped down on power. He won re-election overwhelmingly in 2010, under circumstances decidedly less free and fair than 5 years prior. Repression and violence steadily rose until, unsuspectingly, Nkurunziza decided not to run for a fourth term in 2020. Oh, and meanwhile, in 2018, the capital was relocated back to Gitega, a nice central location. Nkurunziza's successor is Evariste Ndayishimiye, who has remained in power ever since. Poor Burundi still bears the scars of its turbulent recent history. Besides corruption and authoritarianism, Burundi suffers as one of the poorest countries in the world. Most people are subsistence farmers, a situation worsened by the fact that almost the entire country has been deforested, leading to soil erosion. Unable to support its own people, Burundi's overpopulation problem threatens to make itself other nations' problem too. Almost entirely agrarian, Burundi's economy could benefit from mineral reserves, but for the sheer chaos scaring away investors, the East African community promises to open opportunities for the region. We'll see. For now, cash crops are about the only export. What's more, Congo-Kinshasa's Kivu conflict to the west is poised to bleed into Burundi, especially with Rwanda's little adventure in the region. Burundi, therefore, is more than a little suspicious of its northern neighbor, and worried this conflict will soon explode into a wider war, just as the previous ones have. Well, Burundi was interesting, wasn't it? Big things come in small packages. Next time, we're going north to Rwanda, whose story is remarkably similar. See you there.